Yeah, Dot.
So we are on chapter 20 of the book of John, which is near the very end. We might finish today. I don't know.
What verse are we on, John 20?
Beginning, the very first verse.
Okay.
The
empty tomb.
So, yeah. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. You know what I noticed reading that, and I've read this before, but my first thought is, I think, well, so Mark has the, well, does Mark, I don't know, I can't remember now if Mark has an angel or not in the original ending. I think it just ends. Anyway, the other two, an angel appears to the women first, right? And this one, the women leave and there's no, they even just think that the body's been taken, right? It's interesting the different resurrection accounts differ in little but very significant ways. And here we have the whole thing and it's just an empty tomb still, although we're going to obviously get to beyond that, but just out of curiosity. Mark, as we say, the original ending of Mark
16, 1 through 8.
Yeah. Mary Magdalene, Mary Mother James, Salome, they went to the stone had been turned away. That they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. So they in Mark 2 they see an angel. I think in all three of the other gospels they see someone who is probably an angel, but interesting, not at least not at first in John.
And the thing that bothers me is they just went home. It was like, oh well.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what else were they supposed to do?
Hang out.
There wasn't anything
Right.
they could do there.
Right. What? Yeah, it's a good point.
But they could have gone and talk to other people to see if they saw anything, do a little investigating.
in Matthew, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Suddenly there was a great earthquake. An angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone. So they saw the stone rolled away, unlike the other one. See, they're little differences, but it's interesting.
Well, and then in the next verses on mine, it has the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside crying as she wept. Then they saw the two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been. So
yeah,
the angels did show up.
Oh, there. Oh, right. I got you. But earlier on, it said she ran. It doesn't say that she followed them back to the tomb. So they left the tomb. She went. That's strange. I'm curious. I want to look at the end of Luke now because they have little subtle differences that I find fascinating. The women had gone to the tomb. The stone was already rolled away from the tomb. So in Matthew, it's rolled away in their presence, but the other three, it's not. The body was not there, and while they were perplexed about it, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. Yeah, I guess it's still there, just the next.
In Luke, it says the Son of Man must be delivered, no, he said he is not here, but he is risen. But in John, it doesn't say anything about him being. They don't recognize that it's part of the, of
Well,
prophecy.
this next verse, as Nancy said, does say that Mary stood outside the tomb weeping, but what I'm confused about is the order thing here. They went in the tomb, he's not there. She leaves, she goes to the other disciples. It does not say she returns.
Well, they must have, or
Right.
they wouldn't be there.
Right. Yeah, I'm just saying it's kind of strange. It doesn't say that she joined them. Yeah. Huh. So there is an angel, but it's a different kind of order. Well, John does that a lot, that there's sort of a weird different order of the things anyway.
If you're getting information from a lot of different sources and writing it down at different times,
Yeah.
it's like reading your newspaper and trying to figure out what really happened there.
Well, we say this a lot, right, with the Gospels that not only the earliest one, Mark, was still written 20, 30 years later, right?
Yeah.
So that's the earliest one.
Yeah.
And so the accounts have minor. It's not that, like I always say this. It's not that I dispute it, that I say, well, they're different, so they're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. It's just interesting the way the differences are interesting to me because, well, here it's less so than other places in the Gospels, but because you can sort of see where the author was coming from, where the writer was coming from.
Yeah.
Their own sort of what they thought was important or what they thought was, more valuable or whatever. I think the most different one is probably Matthew, that says the women got there, and then when they got there, there was lightning or thunder, and the stone rolled away, which the other three don't say at all. Like, they watched the stone being rolled away, which is, it's interesting with Matthew. Earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lot of, I think one of Matthew's motivations is to prove that Jesus is the Son of God through prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So he's the one that quotes Isaiah a lot and such, right? Well, you realize that if Matthew has the women getting there as the stone is being rolled away, then there's no way the body could have been stolen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's another way of proving that Jesus is the Messiah of prophecy, which is just, like I said, it's like the bias of the writer, right? There's always a little bit of the bias of the writer in anything, but yeah. And then they went home. They returned to their homes. You're right. What the way to do, but you'd think my thought was they should say, well, and then they went and told the other disciples.
Yeah.
It's okay that they left, but why home? Oh, well, okay. Let's just go home, go to bed.
Well, because they just could not really take it all in.
Well, for sure. Yeah. I don't normally, I've been doing most of the reading lately because not everybody can. We have some people that have trouble seeing it and whatever, but would anyone like to read this next section, 11 to 18?
Well, but Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell him where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoken these things to her. There's where the angels come in.
Mhm. I love that. I love that line. Supposing him to be the gardener.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did too.
I think have you ever seen someone you know and not where you expect them to be? And
Mhm.
you don't even though you know them very well, you don't recognize them because they're not in the right context.
Especially now with the masks.
Well, yeah, right.
Especially what?
With people wearing masks.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I
There's an
had
old joke about your pastor. No matter which pastor it is, when you run into him in the grocery store, I didn't recognize you with your clothes on.
with, right. Yeah, it's I think that two things about all of the resurrection accounts is that Jesus appeared first to the women, which I think is awesome. I think that's kind of neat. And secondly, he's never recognized at first. And I don't think people say, well, because he was one of the gospels that I think says something like who he was veiled from their eyes or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's partly that they just don't expect to see him, right?
Yeah.
When you don't expect to see someone, you don't. I had a friend one time visit me out of the blue that I wasn't expecting. I walked outside in my house to leave to go somewhere, and my friend who from Denver, when I was living up in the mountains, had pulled in the parking lot, and they got out of the car, and I knew who it was, but I was like, I've never seen you in this context, so I'm like, I was literally like, I had no words. I was like, like, and I couldn't come up with their name, and this is a good friend, and I'm like, if I had been down in Denver at their house, it wouldn't, but it was the where we were and the context that I was confused for a few minutes, right? I feel like that's sort of what's going on with Mary when Jesus appears to her. It's always all of the gospels have it sort of where she thinks he's the gardener or he's a stranger, or the road to Emmaus where he's walking, which is walking with the two disciples, and they don't recognize him, until he speaks to them. And the other thing that I don't know that we realize is so radical now. It's not, we don't realize it because it's not as radical now, but the fact that the first witnesses to the resurrection were women.
Mm-hmm.
You understand how radical that was at the time.
Yeah.
Here's this is, I'm not making this up. A woman's, actually, even till, gosh, really modern times, a woman's testimony wasn't considered valid in a court of law. Certainly at that time, and even heck in some places to this day, but even in the US up to the last 100 years or so, right? So the fact that the witness to the resurrection is a woman is pretty radical. That women were the ones that reported it to, because if this was a court case, that would have been thrown out. and the gospel writers say, nope, the women are valuable to the story. That's a very, it doesn't seem like a radical thing today, but it's a really radical thing for the time of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And even for, like I said, for even a couple hundred years ago would have been a radical kind of a concept, right? Which is kind of cool. And then all four gospels have that.
Yeah.
That the first people that Jesus appeared to were the women. And primarily Mary Magdalene, although in some cases there's other people around, but do we, oh gosh, I've gotten this out a few times when we've done Bible studies, but it's at the church. I have a parallel where the four gospels are side by side, and you can see the differences between them.
Mhm.
I don't want to do what I just did with the last passage and go pour through the other ones, but I don't remember the other gospels saying that his message to the disciples was, "I'm about to ascend to heaven."
Mm.
I think that might be unique in John.
Mm.
But maybe not. I mean, I don't remember that being the message. Yeah. Now, when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." I'm going to continue because this is normally done as one gospel, so I'm going to want gospel reading. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told them, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." So this whole story from 19 to 29 is the gospel every year. You know, we have a 3-year cycle, but it's the gospel every year, the second or third Sunday after Easter, and it's only in John. The story of Thomas, like the wedding of Cana at the beginning of John, is one of those stories that's only in John, which I think I really love the story, right? Because it's not just about Thomas. We like to put it on Thomas, but it's about all of us in a way, right? Any thoughts?
Well, the last one that you didn't read yet, he says, "The reason I've told you all this is so that you will believe," which is what we've been saying all along with John's, his gospel, is that the reason he's doing this is so that people will believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that he had come.
Yeah, it's I'm guilty of it, I admit, but it's hard to like encapsulate, okay, this gospel is different from the other three in this way, in one sentence, right? But I've never I've read through the other gospel. I've read personally through the other gospels. I've never done a Bible study through the Gospel of John before, and I had with the other ones. What's interesting to me about John is John is proving that Jesus is the Messiah through theology, which is interesting. Like he's not through. So Matthew, as I said earlier, is doing it through prophecy, right? Because he's the Messiah, because it said so in Isaiah, it said so in other prophets before. And John is doing it the same kind of thing, but in a different way, with a different tool, basically, right? And I love that you're right. It says, I don't know if you guys have the title of that section, "The Purpose of This Book," so that people may believe, right? And if anything, early in the Gospel of John, I find it sometimes, I don't know. I mean, I hate to use the word annoying about a gospel, but sometimes earlier in the book of John, it's like a sentence that was like this: Pastor Dan went to the grocery store. He did that so he could get food so that he could eat because he was hungry and he needs food for the next week. I'm like, why? Stop explaining everything. We know why Pastor Dan went to the grocery store, right? But early on in John, the first 10 chapters of John, it's like, one simple sentence that we can understand, but then it's, well, this is why he said that, or this is why he did that, or and we're kind of like, but it comes back to this, the explanation, like John explains everything that Jesus did in theological terms.
I got a
And
question for you, Pastor Dan.
yeah,
Do you think that there was collaboration between the four in developing the Gospels and in the writing of them?
we know that there was collaboration. Well, not collaboration in terms of they didn't work together. We don't think they worked together, but the other three Gospels, Mark was written early enough ahead of Luke and Matthew that even the verb tense and the order of the words, so the order, one of the things we know is that the way Koine Greek, ancient Greek, was written is the words can be put in sort of a variety of different order in a sentence. And a lot of both Mark and Luke have the exact same word order as Mark. So it's an accepted thing that Mark was a source for both Luke and Matthew. Doesn't mean they collaborated in that sense. So there are
compiled after like 108, AD.
What's that?
Weren't they compiled as essentially into what were then known as the Gospels and the New Testament, or the Old Testament, or New Testament? Sorry, weren't they compiled and put together after 100 AD?
Well, so the Mark was written around 60, 62, I think is what they think, which is pretty neat that they can nail it down to a year, but around 62 AD. Luke and Matthew are as early as 70, as late as 90. And most people put them in the mid 80s, 82 to 85. I think Luke is supposedly a little later than Matthew, and then John may be even after 100. John's somewhere between 90 and 110 probably that they think was written, and I think part of it is they were written
for. Did John write it then?
Huh?
Was John the author at that point? Seems
Not,
like he'd be a little old for that.
Most of the Gospels are not written by the original disciples. Okay. If they were attributed to original disciples, it was only as an honorific.
Okay.
It put,
Understand.
So what? But that I know I didn't answer your question. I did that intentionally. There were several so the actual New Testament canon was put together in the 300s at the Council of, I think it was the Council of Nicaea. There's two, but the Council of Nicaea is one of them. And so when they finally said, okay, here's the books we're going to put together for, this will be what will become the New Testament, the Greek Bible, the New Testament, was around 300-ish. And I know for sure, like they considered at least 9 different Gospels for the 4 that would be included. But of course, we don't have any original text. In fact, in most cases, all we have is translations of the original text. So it's it's a little bit muddy. But in the 300s, they considered at least the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, not Judas Iscariot. I don't remember, but there were nine Gospels considered for the 4 that were included. And I almost find it a little bit ironic because I'll use the Gospel of Thomas for not that I don't love the Gospels that we have, but because Luke and Matthew use Mark as a source, there's a lot of like 98% of not just the words, but the sentence structure of Mark is included in Luke and Matthew. So to me, if I'm going to choose those 3, I want to include Mark because that's the earliest gospel, the most original source, right?
Okay.
Gospel of Thomas is really interesting because the Gospel of Thomas is the most like a source that we call Q. So Luke and Matthew both share a lot of other information that's very similar to each other, including in word structure, sentence structure, and stuff. And it's not Mark, so they call it Q, which just means quell, which is a Latin word quell, which means source. And Thomas is much like Q, so I almost think that would be a good. If I'm picking the Gospels to be included, I would have Thomas and Mark and John, and then one of the other two, or maybe both of them. But Thomas should be in there because if you take Thomas and Mark side by side, you get 98% of Matthew and Luke.
Interesting.
And the Gospel of Thomas you can buy, you can read. It doesn't read the same way as the other Gospels, which I think is part of why it wasn't included originally. It's not like a narrative in the same way. It's more just the teaching. It doesn't have, and he traveled here and he did this. It has more what he said and what Jesus said and did, the sayings, the teaching. So yeah, I think you mentioned about, did they collaborate? I mean, sort of, right? The Matthew and Luke at least used Mark as a source. John is interesting because John almost completely diverges from the other three. There's a lot of stories that are only in John and not in the other three, and there's a lot of stories in the other three, all three of them, and not in John. And you could say, well, it's partly because of that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, but also I think there's got to be something else. And we got to remember the Gospels too were written they weren't written to be an extra account of the resurrection of Jesus. They were written to be it was almost like a letter written for a specific community, that is specific group of people. Some we think that some of the Gospels were probably written for communities that a higher percentage of Jews, and some of the Gospels written for communities that were a higher percentage of Gentiles, right? So different words and different writing meant different things to different populations, right? So that's why different Gospels were written down for different groups of people. John is so different that it feels to me that John didn't even know, even though it's written 60, 70 years later, that John didn't even know of the existence of Mark. This is just my guess, and we'll never know. But when you look at where Paul did all of his travels, his visits, his writings, it's in modern day Greece and Turkey, roughly halfway between Rome and Jerusalem. Okay, if you're looking at the Mediterranean, I think we tend to forget at the first 300 or 400 years after Christ, there were thriving Christian communities along the north coast of Africa. The Library of Alexandria was there, and some of the most quoted early Christian writers, and I mean Christian writers, which is saying a big thing, right? In that time, between up the first few hundred years after Christ, we're all in northern Africa, but we don't have anybody doing any kind of mission there, anybody starting churches there. We don't have any, and I know that had to have happened, but we have no accounts of it in the Bible. So my theory, it's totally my theory, is that John could have originated from a Christian community in North Africa, but because that's the only way I can see that it would be so radically different from the other Gospels. Because Mark there had to been copies of Mark, basically. And that sounds like, well, of course there are copies, but copies of a book were rare, right? The original copy of Mark was probably passed among several communities, but the fact that both Matthew and Luke had access to it meant that probably people made copies of the book of Mark, and it was in several places, not hundreds, but maybe, tens of places in the early Christian world, which makes it curious why 60 years later that John doesn't seem to have any connection to it at all. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but there you are.
Yeah, I appreciate the explanation. That was the question I had. Didn't mean to take up too much of the.
No. I mean, I think it's worth. It's good to know. I think it's good to know when the Gospels were written, where they were written, why they were written, who wrote them, before you ever start reading them, because it's good to know where the people are coming from. And I have to do it gently, but in this Bible study, other place, I have to say, there's with the possible exception of Mark, and I don't even think that one, the Gospels weren't written by the disciples. People think they were firsthand accounts, and it's just not. There's a lot of literary reasons it's not possible. Mark could have, and I don't think it's likely, but could have possibly seen Jesus at some point. Wasn't a disciple. There's Paul mentions a John Mark that traveled with him, and so if John Mark was young enough, maybe he could have seen Jesus. You know, it's possible. But even then, it's 30 years after Jesus has ascended to heaven, and lifespans were, for most people, were 40, 50 years. So it would have been possible, but not super likely. That doesn't mean that the sources aren't good sources, that it's still not the inspired word of God, right? I always hesitate to say that. I don't want to sound like I'm disparaging scripture or something by saying they were written later. They just were. Now there could have been, there certainly were verbal accounts, and there could have been other written accounts that people wrote down part of what was in the gospel, and it got handed to other people or whatever, down the road. Part of the problem was paper was so expensive at the time. Paper was extremely valuable and extremely rare, that they didn't bother to write things down. And so what they did write down didn't last very long. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think are the earliest full pieces of scripture we have, were probably written down, like, I'm trying to remember, like 500 or 600 AD. So, they survived, but anything else didn't survive. So we have little tiny pieces, scraps of pieces. I have a former seminary professor who studied this, I forget what it's called. There's a word for these. Anyway, a scrap of paper that's like an inch by an inch and it has like 4 letters on it. And they determined that it was from like 200 AD, and it's part of one of the Gospels. And so it's such an exciting thing. And they managed it from like 4 letters, determine it was from one of the 4 Gospels. How? I don't know. But hi, Pat, how are you?
Well, I was going to get in at 10 o'clock, but I've had one phone call coming in after another.
Well, you're a popular woman.
That's all business.
Oh, we are just finishing chapter 20 of John and on to chapter 21, which is the last chapter of John. So you can join us here. We just had a whole long talk about when and how and who wrote the Gospels. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. You mentioned, Nancy, about that they're written so you may come to believe. I also love the fact that it says, and I think the other Gospels do this to some degree, Jesus did a lot of other signs. I love that. It's like, well, we didn't bother writing everything that he said and did down. He did some other stuff. He healed more people, and I think this is mainly referring to after the resurrection, right? But I think that there's also an implication that we just wrote down the important stuff. He did other stuff too. Right? He healed other people. He did other teaching. I kind of love that. I love that there's some mystery, right? That that the writer just said, oh, Jesus, the other stuff, you're fine. You got the important stuff. Can someone read the first part of chapter 21 through verse 14?
After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together Simon Peter, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard it, that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
I want to go back for just a second. Didn't verse 30 and 31 of chapter 20 feel like an ending?
Yes.
The purpose of the book. My Bible says probably the original conclusion of the book. And then chapter 21, differences in the language and style of chapter 21 and the fact that 20, 30, 31 sounds like the end of a book lead most scholars to believe that this chapter is an appendix or epilogue added onto the gospel, perhaps by another member of the same Christian community and based on existing traditions. In John 20, as in Luke 24, all the appearances of Jesus were near Jerusalem. Here, as in the end of Matthew and Mark, an appearance occurs in Galilee. So not only did it feel like an ending, but right before this, you know, it's near Jerusalem where he was crucified, and now he's in Galilee where they are. So it's not that it didn't, you know, it almost feels like time has passed, right? Some more time has passed, and they've returned, because most of them are from Galilee. But were they in hiding in Jerusalem or in hiding other places? You know, and again, this story with the cast of net on the other side is only in John too. So one of those ones there's a lot of stories like that are just in John. And it wasn't unusual. Like I said, Mark has at least 2 extra endings. It wasn't unusual picture the gospel as like a journal. It was like a diary, right? It wasn't like I took Larry's book and I wrote another ending to it because I didn't like the first ending. That wouldn't make any sense, right? But that's not what these books were. That, you know, they said, well, but there's another story. Let's just make sure we add that story in, so the story is more complete. It wasn't plagiarism. It wasn't, you know, that was kind of normal. So you saw that in a lot of stories. That was a lot of the Greek tragedies had sort of extra scenes added on to the end, and I think the same thing kind of thing happened where the original story was written and then they added these scenes at the end, which are probably written by other people. They said, well, I want to clarify what this character did in the tragedy. So let's add this one other scene. And it was normal, even if it wasn't by the same author, they would do that. This is sort of a, it would be weird today, but it was a literary kind of tradition that they would do back then. And quite possibly not the same author as who wrote the original part of it. And that's another thing that makes it sound, but they can't do that, but that's normal, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the books in the Bible were written by 2 or 3 different authors.
Yeah.
That's okay, right? What do you think? Every time I read this story, I'm curious why they give the exact number of fish.
Gives it authenticity.
I always wonder, so many times when numbers in the Gospels are used, there's a reason. It refers to something else. But I've mentioned I'm not actually a fan of numerology in general, because I think when you do that with Revelation, you get yourself into trouble. But in the Gospels, especially in the feeding of the 5,000, the numbers are really important. 153 sounds like such a weird, like, I don't believe that they actually counted them, right? Like if I was married to a marine biologist, they pull in a net full of fish, they don't go 1, 2, 3, they put them in a big bucket, right? They don't. So why 150?
You think that was the original in the Greek?
Probably. Yeah. So my Bible says 153. Many suggestions have been made for a symbolic interpretation of the number, often centering on the fact that 153 is the sum of all numbers from 1 through 17. That's weird. At any rate, the large number may be meant to symbolize the expansion of the church. What if, this is just conjecture, what if there were exactly 153 members of the church that was being written to for the Gospel of John, or something like that, I don't know. Like the story would have been just fine if it said they caught a whole lot of fish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? The other thing is, what did these disciples do for a living? What was the one thing they knew how to do?
Fish.
Fish. And then Jesus, who as a trade was probably a carpenter, but they didn't even know who it was, says, oh, by the way, put your nets on the other side. Again, I was married to a marine biologist. If you haven't caught any on one side, you're not going to catch any on the other side. Right?
Well, I've been fishing where people at the back of the boat caught a whole lot more than the people at the front of the boat. I never knew why.
That maybe they were better fishermen. But I like that they just did it. They're like, well, whatever. We haven't caught any fish. We may as well try the other side. Right?
Do you think they suspected it might be him and did it because of that? Or do you think they just did it because?
I do. I mean, right before they says children.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
children doesn't necessarily mean that, like, it implies that he is either older or has some position of authority over them, but they don't know who it is. So, and he's not probably older. So it's interesting. He almost identifies, he doesn't quite say, hey, by the way, I'm Jesus, but by saying children.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why. Well, then they catch the fish and then they say, oh, it must be the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. Could it kind of been a term of endearment almost?
Yeah, maybe. Well, it's 10 till, and normally I'd start winding down, but we only have half a chapter to go. So I say we forge on ahead and finish.
Okay.
When they had finished breakfast, unless someone has a question about that last section. Why, there's another detail. There's a bunch of details in this particular passage that are interesting. Why'd they have to tell us that Peter was naked?
Why did he jump in the water with his clothes on?
Right.
After he, I mean, why not jump in the water naked? Sorry, but it just seems kind of like backwards, doesn't it? But maybe he had to cover himself because he was embarrassed. He knew that it was Jesus, and he swam ahead of them, got on the shore, started the fire, put the fish on, and then waited for everybody else to show up.
But why mention that he doesn't have to mention it all. He just say Simon Peter, when Simon Peter heard the Lord, he jumped into the sea and went to see him. But why care about he was naked, he put on some clothes? I mean, some of the details I wonder. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it was just to show respect, you know.
Yeah. I also love that some of the most intimate moments of the Gospels are around food. The Last Supper, the feeding of the 5,000. There's very many times that the intimate moments in the Gospels are around food, which I find really neat. You know, when we say that the thing that I miss the most about church isn't church. The thing I miss most about church is fellowship time.
Mm-hmm.
Because we haven't figured out a way to reenact fellowship time that feels valuable. I think the way we're doing church is adequate for now. The way we're doing worship is adequate now, but we haven't figured out. What I've noticed is we were doing a Zoom fellowship time for a while, but then for about a month, it was just me and Candy. And we said, you know, we're the hosts. We don't need to be doing this. It was just us.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you've noticed that after church, there's often a group of, 8 or 10 people hanging out and talking with their masks on after worship outside. That's our fellowship time right now. It's kind of neat.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of just happened because people miss talking to each other.
Yeah.
So, I think the value of the fact that, notice Jesus doesn't like teach them or do anything. He just eats. Here, have some bread and some fish. I think that's so neat. Now he will in a second, but it's just neat that food is where a lot of conversations start and end, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to them the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hand and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." This passage is I mean, I've probably said this a lot of times. This is a very studied passage because in the Greek, it's written very interestingly. It almost feels like a riddle in a way. So the word in Greek that Jesus used for love varies in this. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? He's not actually saying that. So if you know the Greek, the first two times I'm reading from my Bible, I knew this already, but the first two times Jesus asked the question, the Greek word for love is agapon. So agapos love is like, do you love me in in community love. The third time is philion, sometimes it's a philios is like I love hamburgers. It's a little bit different, right? There's several words for love in the Greek. So it's interesting that the forms are different, and all of Peter's replies, he uses the word the philium, which is that sort of love of a thing, a little bit different, a lesser type of love compared to the agapos, right? So there's lots of parts of this that are sort of interesting. When they said that Peter would stretch out his hands, what does it look like when you stretch out your hands?
The cross.
The cross. Trying to indicate the kind of martyrdom that Peter would have later on. His martyrdom, which we think happened in Rome, and take you where you do not wish to go. It just feels a little bit like kind of like the 153 fish. Like there's something extra being said here, and I'm not totally sure what it is. Right? Not so much like secret code, but something that would have been understood either to Jesus and Peter or to the community that was getting this gospel, that was reading this gospel for the first time. They asking the 3 teams. Now, Grant, I love do you love me? If you love me, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. I mean, that's a super valuable lesson. That's all sort of the surface thing, right? We can read that and say, okay, it's all about, if we love Jesus, we tend Jesus' sheep, which is wonderful. But then he says it 3 times. He says it with different words for love, right? He says lambs and sheep, which are not the same thing. So it's sort of, there's other layers to it that I will admit I don't really totally understand, right? Mm-hmm. There's definitely layers there. I can see the layers. I'm just not sure what they mean. Right? It feels a little bit also like the Great Commissioning in a way. Right? Like go out and make disciples of all nations, right? It feels a little bit like that. If you love Jesus, feed, tend, take care of, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the 3 different kinds of love, also, I wonder if it's trying to show you that you need to get out of your own little comfort area and love different, like the homeless, love your people that you do be around. There's, several layers of people that you need to love also, not just your best friends or your family. There's a lot more to that than.
I wanted to quickly I'm reading from an online source, but it's so philia is a bond between friends, and agape is unconditional God love. So a little bit different. So Peter's responding to Jesus with, yeah, I love you, I'm your friend, right? But Jesus's question to Peter is, agape, do you love me unconditionally? Which is, it's almost like he doesn't get it the first couple times. There's one way you could, and we know that Peter doesn't get it a lot. I don't know. There's lots of ways to read that. It's interesting. I'm sorry. I was half listening to you, Kalita. Can you say that again? No, please, because I was reading something while you said that.
No, that's kind of what I was saying. You don't only love your friends and your family. You've got to go out to your community. You've got to go out to the homeless. There's a lot of levels of that love besides inside the church.
Yeah, and it makes me think Jesus, if Jesus is saying agape, he's saying, do you, I'm trying to figure out another way to word it. Uh, do you love me as deep as possible, right? And Jesus and Peter replies, yeah, I love you. You're my buddy. And he's like, do you love me so much you would give your life for me? Yeah, I love you. You're my friend. Okay. Right? Like it maybe the reason he's repeating it 3 times is like in other places in the gospel, Peter's just a little slow on the uptake, right? Over his head, right? Exactly. I don't know. I think it's a lovely passage, but it always feels a little cryptic to me. The previous passage, the only thing cryptic is 153 fish, but this passage is the whole thing is sort of cryptic. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, but we know that his testimony is true, that there are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. I love that. I love the way it ends.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to what you had said earlier, Bill, about did one of the disciples write it? It is, we don't think the disciples wrote it, but individual disciples could have been the source that it was attributed to, right? So it's possible that we're here, it sort of implies that it doesn't actually say necessarily he's writing, but they're testifying, right? So it could have been, well, this was a certain disciple's testimony that has been passed down through the years, right? But not necessarily written by that disciple.
Well, I'm sure there was an awful lot of generational, our people. This is a story. I'm telling it to you, son. Son, you tell it to your son, and so forth. And
Right.
And then finally somebody wrote it down.
Right. This is the story that was first told by John. Yeah, exactly.
Well, the Gospels were primarily written in Greek, but that wasn't the language of the area at the time, wasn't it? Primarily Aramaic and Hebrew.
No. Aramaic was spoken. Aramaic was kind of the Hebrew, I think, was mainly just used in the temple, kind of like the early Catholic Church, was only had Latin, right? And the Jews did speak Hebrew, but the common language of the people, it was, the common language of the area was Greek and had been for a couple hundred years. Commerce was done in Greek, which was kind of anything, anywhere where things are bought and sold is usually kind of the primary language. So Jerusalem itself was really a very cosmopolitan city. It was a crossroads for trade for a lot of the known world. So a lot of languages were spoken there. Aramaic was kind of a language that the people that had lived there for centuries spoke as their sort of familial language, and the Greek, that kind of what happened at the time of Jesus is, the Romans are in charge, but if you know a little bit of the world history of the Mediterranean area at that time, the Greeks had done a similar, with Alexander, they had swept through the Mediterranean and tried to convert everybody to Greek worship, to worship of the Greek gods, and were not very successful at it. But they were much more adamant than the Romans were about following our culture and following our religion and following our laws. Where the Romans, as much as we want to badmouth the Romans because of the Bible, the Romans, for the most part, said you can worship whatever you want as long as you pay taxes. So they didn't bother to make people speak Latin. Not that Latin was, Latin was, even the Romans spoke Greek, really, because they were very nearby each other. But where the Greek, you hear that word Hellenized. Have you heard that word before? That the world was, the known Western world was Hellenized, which means a few hundred years before Jesus, the Greeks went out of the way to make everything Greek. Language, culture, religion, everything. So there's a lot of that still lingering around. What happened with the Greeks is if you follow world history, they expanded too much too quickly. And then it sort of was like popping a balloon when they expanded too quickly, and then it sort of collapsed, and the Romans sort of filled that void. But they filled it in such a way that they didn't bother saying, well, we're going to erase the Greek culture and impose our own culture on top of it. We're going to let the Greek culture kind of still sit on top of this, right? So to go back to your original question, almost everybody spoke Greek, at least some Greek. And then different people in that culture would have spoken Hebrew. Some spoke Hebrew, some spoke Aramaic, some spoke Latin, some spoke other languages possibly. But Greek was kind of the common tie between all of them. Like if they went into the temple to speak to someone there to buy from the temple for the sacrifice, they would have spoken Hebrew. But it was also normal for people to speak multiple languages, especially in Jerusalem, which was such a cosmopolitan kind of city. So,
Thank you.
yeah, supposedly there are a few small sections of the New Testament that were not written in Greek, but the 99% was written, and 98% was written in Greek, and the Old Testament was largely written in Hebrew.
Okay.
Which the Aramaic question is sort of Aramaic must have been kind of a regional language. That that.
Okay.
I don't know. It's funny. I used to be really interested in the etymology of language. Where language came from. I don't remember where people say Aramaic came from, what other languages, modern languages it's related to. But it's a totally dead language now, for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you all very much for being here today.
Thank you for
We
hosting.
finished the book of John finally.